race between Germany and Britain. So he was against upping the spending, and then in July 1st, 1911, this German ship called the Panther, which is kind of a cool name for a ship, sailed into this Moroccan harbor with the goal of sort of carving out a place in Africa for Germany, because France and Britain had so far sort of controlled the colonization and resources of Africa. And this started a crisis, an international crisis. It was a direct challenge to France and Britain. There was almost a war. War was averted at the time, but it did convince Churchill that basically Germany had its sights set on domination of Europe, and that war was inevitable. So right after this happened, he was appointed as the First Lord of the Admiralty, which is basically like the Secretary of the Navy, I guess. And he sort of vowed to strengthen the Navy with the idea of this impending war with Germany coming. And his major question, the first question that really he had to deal with when he started, was whether to convert the British Navy from coal to oil. So the British Navy had been sort of their pride and joy for hundreds of years, right? The British Empire spanned the world, the sun never set on the British Empire, etc. And originally, first there were sailing vessels, and then there were coal-fired steam plants to power them. And Britain has lots of coal in Wales, and so the supply of coal was an issue. They have zero oil. So this was obviously a difficult and contentious question, whether to stick with coal or to switch to oil, which was really only available at that time in what was called Persia, which is now Iran. And so his quote at the time was, "To commit the Navy irrevocably to oil was indeed to take arms against a sea of troubles." Basically, it was going to be a huge supply nightmare to switch to oil. But nonetheless, pretty quickly he decided to do it. The strategic advantages outweighed the supply issues, and they committed to oil for their Navy. And the other quote that I liked of his was, "Mastery itself was the prize of the venture." And what's cool about this quote is how it sort of portends the entire 20th century, where oil and mastery kind of go hand in hand. And by mastery, I mean economic, military, political, territorial, whatever. If you control oil, you are the master of whatever sort of context we're talking about. And this quote, I think, is just kind of neat because it really does kind of predict what the next 100 years would look like. And so this story, this anecdote, comes from a book called The Prize, which I have here. It's pretty heavy. It's a long book, but it's really, really good. It's written by a guy named Daniel Yergin. It won the Pulitzer Prize, and it basically is the history of oil. And another way to think about it is it's the history of the past 150 years ago, or past 150 years or so, told through the lens of oil, and how oil has shaped basically our lives and world since then. And so there's three themes I kind of want to touch on that come from this book that I think are really important to kind of frame the rest of the discussion. The first is the rise and development of capitalism and modern business. So to start, actually, can someone tell me what the largest company in the world is? You can just take a guess, just throw it out.
McDonald's?
It's not McDonald's. Walmart. Walmart is the largest company in the world. What about maybe second, third, fourth, and fifth?
Nike.
No, not Nike, sorry.
Coca-Cola?
Nope. Think oil.
Oh, Exxon.
ExxonMobil is number 2. Or no, number 3.
Shell.
Shell is number 2. All right, I'll get rid of the suspense. So Walmart's number 1 by revenue. Shell is an oil company, is number 2. ExxonMobil is 3. BP is an oil company, is 4. Sinopec is the Chinese national oil company. That's 5. So 4 of the first 5. China National Petroleum, also an oil company. Chevron, Total, and ConocoPhillips down there for 10, 11, and 12 are. So 8 of the 12 largest companies in the world are oil companies, which is kind of mind-blowing, right? So you'll see some other companies you recognize, like Toyota. GM used to be much bigger, is not anymore. But the point is, oil is sort of the industry of all industries. It's the largest, most multinational companies in the world are oil companies. And the way we think about modern business has really been shaped by how oil companies have developed over the past 100 years or so. The next theme, the second one there, is oil as a commodity that's intimately intertwined with national strategies in global politics and power. So what precipitated the switch of the British Navy to oil was obviously this conflict with Germany, which eventually led to World War I. What's really interesting, I think, in this book is he tells World War II, the whole story of World War II, kind of through the lens of oil. So the reason actually Hitler invaded the Soviet Union was mostly to get to their oil, which is in the Caucasus. Ended up being a huge blunder. He argues that the reason the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor was to protect their flanks so they could take over all the oil in what's now Indonesia, basically. And actually, at the end of the war, Japan had no oil left. They made a jet fuel out of pine trees, which is a really low-grade jet fuel, and it was so bad that they couldn't do return missions, which is why kamikaze missions started, because they didn't have the range to fly, to bomb, and back. They just had enough fuel to get there. So oil, as part of World War II, obviously the first Gulf War 20 years ago, oil was an important factor. A lot of people would argue that the second Gulf War, that oil was an important factor. And certainly, the oil shocks of the 60s and 70s, all sorts of instances in the 20th century where oil shaped the way countries interacted with each other. I think a lot of people would argue we would be much less interested in the Mideast politically if they didn't have any oil. And then the last is what he calls the rise of hydrocarbon man, which is basically that oil is so intertwined in our lives that life as we know it would not be possible without oil. And that shows up in a ton of ways. So I'm sure some of you are from suburbs. Basically, suburbanization in the United States was enabled because of cars, which was enabled because of oil. So people tended to live much more concentrated in cities. Anything you have that's made of plastic is made from oil. Basically, all modern food production uses fertilizer that comes from oil. So just every facet of your life, oil is a part of it. And if it went away, I think it'd be hard to imagine what our lives would actually be like. I think if you are ambitious, give the book a read or at least a skim. It's pretty interesting. It will change the way you think of, I think, politics and oil and things like that. But let's touch on why oil actually is important. And I would argue that it's nearly a perfect fuel, and the qualification there is what we'll touch on in a little bit. But let's touch on the good things about oil. It is truly an amazing fuel. So first of all, it has incredibly high energy and power density. So by energy density, think of it as basically how far your car can go on a tank of gas. And by power density, think of how quickly your car can accelerate from 0 to 60. And oil, or gasoline, has both. So this plot shows energy density and power density, and gasoline's way far to the right. So that purple, I'm red-green colorblind, so I think it's purple. In the bottom left there, that says PB acid, that's a lead-acid battery. That's what starts your car, just a normal lead-acid battery. That has about 100 times less energy density than gasoline. So if you have a pound of gasoline and a pound of lead-acid battery, the gasoline will get you about 100 times farther. So that's why electric cars haven't quite totally taken off, right? There's some range issues. And it's about 10 times the power density, meaning you could accelerate from 0 to 60 about 10 times faster. So there's just an incredible amount of energy in oil. I mean, think of a gallon of gas it's not that big, right? And it can power a 2,000-pound car and drive you 30 miles, which is, I think, kind of amazing. So it's also extremely easy to transport and to burn. And that's mostly because it's a liquid, right? It's really easy you can pump a liquid, it just sits in the tank. You can pump it down pipelines, it can be transported in trucks. Liquid fuels are much easier to deal with, and it's relatively stable. Even though in like movies, if you like shoot a car with a gun, it blows up. That actually doesn't happen in real life. They put explosives all under the bottom of the car to make that happen. So yeah, gas doesn't burn quite as easy as people make it look like it does. So it's a really, truly incredible fuel, and it's why our cars and transportation system is developed the way it has. So how do we get to this point? The plot on the left shows the percentage of our energy we got from different sources, and so 1850 it could stretch back probably 5,000 years. and wood would always be kind of at the top, right? So people burned wood basically for a long, long time, and maybe a little bit of power from streams and rivers to do milling and things like that. And you can see basically the Industrial Revolution started in the mid-19th century, around 1850, and the rise of coal shot upwards because we started to use coal and steam engines to do manufacturing and transport and things like that. But then as the 20th century begins, there's this rise of oil and gas, and then later in the 20th century, there's a little bit of rise of nuclear power. So this shows the proportions. The plot on the right shows the absolute amounts. So even though wood was 90% of the energy we use, if you look back to 1850 and compare that energy usage to what we use now, it was 1/100th the amount of energy, right? So everyone was using wood, but we weren't using that much, or in an energy perspective. So coal rises, and then you can see petroleum, natural gas shoot upwards. And now basically almost all of our energy comes from some mix of fossil fuels, petroleum, natural gas, and coal, and then nuclear is a non-negligible amount. In the U.S. it's less than in some countries. In Europe, in France, about 80% of electricity comes from nuclear. So it depends on the country, but overall, what this basically shows is we're using way more energy now than we were 100 years ago, and it's mostly coming from fossils. Why is energy use important? Oh, sorry, you have a question?
Oh, yeah, I was wondering what caused the shift to oil? Like, did they discover oil, or like what?
Yeah, basically, in the mid-1800s, I think it started in central Pennsylvania, people sort of discovered oil, and it started to be used to make kerosene to replace whale oil for lamps. So it was lighting, actually. So John D. Rockefeller made all of his money from kerosene at first for lighting. They actually were just running gasoline into rivers at night to get rid of it, or burning it because it was deemed useless. So then they had all this gasoline, they decided to figure out something to do with it. So the internal combustion engine came around sort of around the same time, and then the two of them kind of met to make what we think of as engines. But yeah, at first it was kind of just a happy accident, and then it developed over time. And yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, there's a little rise in usage of coal right around 2000. Does that continue to go up, or has that kind of leveled itself out?
That's a good. So on the one on the left or the one on the right?
The one on the left.
That's almost certainly China, would be my guess.
Okay.
Is basically China has had just ridiculous growth the past 20 or 30 years, and they have a lot of coal. They don't have a lot of oil and gas, and so I would guess that would be my guess. Yeah, it's a good question. That's a really good question. You'll see pretty soon in a lot of stats I show that China is kind of the elephant in the room when it comes to energy use, and especially energy trends. I think it would be hard to find something else that correlates better with economic growth and success than energy consumption. It's hard to have an economy without energy, to manufacture things, to transport goods, to make food, to build houses, whatever. Every part of sort of a functioning economy relies on energy. And so the plot on the left shows energy usage in the world and the gross world product. So basically like the GDP, only measure the economy of the whole world. And they follow each other, although you can see that the slope on energy usage is a little less steep, and that's because we use energy a little more efficiently now than we did 50 years ago. So it doesn't go quite at the same amount. But basically, economic success and energy go hand in hand, as well as quality of life. So the plot on the left shows GDP per capita, so basically how rich we are per person in a country versus how much energy we use per person. And you can see it basically increases up and to the right. In the US, we're way up. We're very rich and we use a ton of energy. Japan is very rich and uses slightly less energy. Canada is pretty rich and uses a lot of energy. And then the rest of the Western Europe's kind of in the middle there, and then a lot of countries down on the bottom. But you can see basically as energy use goes up, wealth goes up. The one on the right is a little hard to see, but what's plotted on the y-axis is the Human Development Index, which is sort of a measure of quality of life, measured by things like access to medical care, clean water, sanitation, lighting, all sorts of things like that, versus energy use again. And what's kind of interesting about this is there's a huge increase in quality of life with a small increase in energy use. right? So if you have no energy and can add a little bit of energy to people's lives, you can increase their quality of life really dramatically at first. And then there's kind of diminishing returns where, we don't need to use all the energy we do to be happy. We could probably have smaller houses and still be pretty happy, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a decline in the slope, at least, as you move to the right. Energy by region. So the U.S., we have about 4% of the world's population. We use about 25% of the world's power or energy. It is not particularly proportional. China, on the other hand, has about 20% of the world's population, also uses about 20% of the world's energy. So they have 5 times the people, about the same amount of energy, so we use about 5 times as much energy per person as China. I think you could probably guess that band is narrowing. India is 17% of the world's population, only 7% of energy consumption. China's been growing faster and is a little richer than India. But as these people in China and India, quality of lives improve, they're going to use more and more energy. So this trend is not going to go away. The plot on the right just shows basic percentage of energy used by different continents. And there's a steady rise in Asia over the past 30 years or so. So that was my goal, is to try to set some context for modern issues in energy. And my summary is that first, obviously, energy use is responsible for the world as we know. And I touched on that before, this idea of hydrocarbon man. And energy is a good thing. Like, I don't want to denigrate the use of energy as something bad or whatever. It has done more to improve people's quality of life than just about anything else. It's a wonderful thing. The U.S. consumes a lot of energy, probably not quite our fair share, if you wanted to argue that, but we consume a lot of energy. We're very wealthy, and we're lucky to be in the position we are. And most of our energy comes from fossil fuels, certainly in the U.S., worldwide as well. Oil in particular is important, but natural gas is growing in importance, and coal as well. And there's a but, right? There's always a but, and it's a big one, which is a few things, I guess. There's increasing competition for limited resources, right? Oil is a finite resource, coal is a finite resource, etc. That's showing up mostly with oil. Obviously, all the conflicts we talked about in the Mideast, the issues we're having with Venezuela. Oil somehow happens to be in a lot of countries that are kind of quasi-unstable or somewhat hostile. Not Canada, obviously. We get along with Canada. But it happens to be in a lot of volatile regions, and disruptions of oil supply can really send an economy in the tanks. That happened in the 70s. There's huge issues with that. And then the last one, which I'm going to touch on, is fossil fuel combustion releases carbon. And so let's talk about carbon. This plot shows the world emissions of carbon. So who's emitting carbon by year? And so the U.S. is I guess that's purple-ish line towards the top. Well, that's always been the top up until about 3 years ago when China passed us. So China actually emits more carbon than us, even though we use about the same amount of energy. They emit more carbon. So we're a little more efficient. They burn a lot of coal. They have older cars, not as good lighting, whatever. And then everyone else is kind of an order of magnitude lower. That yellow line is, I think, Russia. So there's a huge, actually, drop in output in Russia because when the Soviet Union fell, their productivity went
Do you
down.
want to save questions to the end?
No, I like it
No?
now.
Okay,
Yeah,
great.
please, go ahead and ask.
Do you know if China's done anything to limit the pollution? 'Cause, I mean, this isn't going to help.
So I don't know a ton about that. I know that air quality in China is really bad. Like even during the '08 Olympics, there was some issues with the athletes were concerned about being able to actually break world records and things because of the quality of the air. People definitely wear the surgical masks sometimes to go out. I think it's quite bad in Beijing and Shanghai. The air quality is really bad. China's basically doing a throw everything against the wall strategy, which is their hunger for energy is so high that they need it from everything. So they're building new coal plants almost every day. They're also building a ton of new wind, new solar, anything they can get their hands on, basically. Their economy is just growing so fast, they'll take anything. Yeah. Yes?
Does that trend show any sign of slowing down?
I think it's accelerating, unfortunately. Yeah, their economy is growing like 7 or 8% a year, and it has been. I mean, you know, things aren't looking great economically right now, but I think the long-term prospects are that China is going to keep increasing its energy use. Like I said, they have 5 times the people as us, right? And so their quality of life is still far below us on average. The hope is that there's leapfrogging, right? For instance, in Africa, most people never got landlines. They went straight to cell phones. And so the hope is that if technology gets better and better, that China will sort of not use so much obsolete technology that's inefficient, but will leapfrog up to better and better technology, which will hopefully slow that rate down. But you're fighting a really a lot of momentum in just sort of the economic and population growth there. So it's daunting. Okay, this is where, let's see, the amount of carbon we emit by source in the US, and then where that carbon comes from. So on the far right is electricity generation, which is the largest emitter of carbon, and then coal, oil, and natural gas as a proportion of the total amount of carbon emitted by electricity generation. So from an electricity perspective, most of our carbon emissions come from coal. Not surprisingly, in transportation, most of our carbon emissions come from oil. And then there's industrial use, residential use, commercial, which I don't know how that differs from industrial. And for whatever reason, the U.S. territories are broken up. But it's kind of about maybe 40% of our carbon emissions come from coal, 40% from oil, and 20% from natural gas, give or take. So it's you know, even if we got all of our electricity from wind, there's still the transportation issue to deal with. It's a daunting problem. You know, there's still people who deny this is happening, but it's hard to argue with the fact that global mean temperatures have been rising for about, I don't know, the past 100 years, basically when we started to emit large amounts of carbon. And that's due to carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. It traps heat in the atmosphere, causes global temperatures to rise. I think 10 of the past 11 summers on the East Coast have been the 10 hottest summers on recorded record. It's been hot. There's droughts all over the country right now because of how hot it's been. But you can see on the left here, basically, the global mean temperature normalized to 1980. And the black line is basically CO2 emissions, and then you know, they it doesn't take a genius to realize that they kind of go hand in hand. And then on the left is the global mean temperature going back to around 1860, and again you can see it rises through time. So there's other factors, right? There's these geological factors and whatever, but the rate at which the temperature on the Earth is warming is unprecedented. So there have been large-scale temperature changes, but those happen over ice ages, like tens of thousands of years, not 100 years. Oh yeah, okay, so here we go. We're going back 12,000 years. It's kind of hard to see on the left there, but basically, yeah, there's been ice ages and changes in global temperature of large scales, but the slope hasn't been nearly as high as it is just over the past 100 years. So that's basically what I'm getting at. I think it would be hard to argue rationally against climate change. Okay, so now what? So we know that energy use is great. It improves our quality of life. There's, 2 billion people in the world who live on less than $1 a day or something like that. And just light bulbs can make a huge difference. You know, the really little things can make a huge difference in people's quality of life. And the developing world's demand for energy is not going to slack. It's going to accelerate, especially China and India, but also Africa over the next 50 years or so. On the other hand, fossil fuels produce carbon, which leads to climate change. And the consequences of climate change are pretty catastrophic, which I'm not going to really dive into today, but hopefully you're aware of that. And I think it's unrealistic to expect people to stop using energy to reduce. People, as altruistic as you are, it's hard to really throw away the quality of life you have, right? It's just natural to want to preserve what you have. And so the question is, what do we do? How do we deal with this? And some people argue carbon sequestration, where you take the carbon output from like a coal plant and you pump it underground into these geological formations, and it's supposed to just sort of sit there for millions of years and hopefully never escape. And, it could work. People are testing it. There's companies doing it. It kind of scares me. I wouldn't want to live next to it because if it flooded out, you would literally suffocate. So that would not be cool. And it's just, to do it at large scales, I think is very hard. It's very hard to separate carbon from the atmosphere itself. The only thing that do it well are plants. And they're quasi, more or less free, but quite enough of them. So carbon sequestration, I'm not so sure about. I think the other option is non-carbon emitting sources of energy, which is basically what I'm going to talk about now, and specifically wind power as a promising option to at least produce some of our energy over the next 100 years in a carbon-free manner. And I'm specifically going to focus on offshore because I think to do this at the scale we need to make a dent in energy usage and climate change, it has to be offshore, and we'll touch on why later on. But first, let's talk about where the wind comes from. I shouldn't have shown the first thing. Did everyone know that the wind comes from the sun? The wind is basically like thrown away solar power in some sense. It's kind of cool. I had a professor who argued that almost all power is nuclear power at the end of the day because the sun is nuclear fusion, right, which produces solar energy, which produces wind. Wind actually makes the waves, so waves in the ocean is due to wind. And solar power produce plants, which then formed fossil fuels millions of years ago, right? It's not dinosaurs, it's like algae that made oil and coal and stuff like that. But all of that came from the sun, yeah.
Isn't wind also like a change in weather?
Yeah, so weather and wind are kind of interrelated, and we're gonna touch on that. I think on the next slide I can make that kind of clear. So the amount of energy that hits the Earth due to the sun is this number here, 1.7 times 10 to the 17th watts. So that's the amount of power, hitting the Earth from the sun. On average, the world consumes 1.6 times 10 to the 13th watts, meaning 10,000 times as much energy hits the Earth from the sun as actual energy the entire Earth consumes. So there's a ton of solar energy just hitting the Earth. That's kind of an amazing amount. About 1 to 2%. Oh yes, please.
For like how you're consuming it from like when the sun hits, is that like per day or like per year?
It's the instantaneous amount. So it's power. How do I put this? If we took all the energy that hit the Earth in a year, divided by the total number of seconds in the year, this would be the amount. Sort of. It's like.
Is it like how much is actively headed towards Earth?
Yeah. I'm not good at distinguishing power and energy in an obvious way. So power is energy per unit time. So it's how much, it's sort of think of it as how much energy every second. And if you think of it that way, there's just this massive amount just pouring from the sun and hitting us. So like I said, about 10,000 times more than we use. So 1 to 2% of that is converted to wind. So there's a ton of wind, right? There's more wind power in the wind than it could easily power the Earth, 10 times over probably. So wind is a form of solar power. Wind, like I said, produces waves. So when people talk about wave power, that's some source of wind power. Okay, so where does wind come from, and what do we mean by weather? Basically, the sun hits the Earth at the equator more than the poles. Duh, right? When things get hot, when air gets hot, it rises, right? And cold air sinks. Everyone knows that. What happens is basically then at the equator, hot air rises up, cold air from the poles sinks down and will fill in, and you would get sort of a big circulatory pattern just going north to south and south to north, except that the Earth is spinning, which makes it a little tricky. So when you're on a spinning object, things get a little weird. And this is called the Coriolis effect. Taking high school physics, you've probably heard of this, but they learned this when they shot cannonballs. They started bending to the right, and no one knew why. And when trains are going down tracks, the right track gets worn out more than the left. And so weird things like that, but it's only at really large scales, but this Coriolis effect shows up. It's basically because we're on a rotating sphere, and we're in a, it's not really worth going into the details, but the Coriolis force basically causes things to sort of rotate a bit. So we have this big global pattern of recirculation due to the heating of the sun, but then we have the Coriolis forces, and what you get are prevailing winds, which is in many ways what we think of as weather. So at our latitude, the prevailing wind basically causes this flow of air around the Earth from west to east, right? So if there's a thunderstorm in the Midwest, it usually comes and hits us on the East Coast later on. A little south of us, in the kind of 0 to 30 degree latitudes, the wind actually blows from east to west. So that's what people called trade routes back when people were sailing, right? You would, if you're coming from Europe to the US, you would start south, you do like a big loop. You come south to like the Caribbean and then you head back north. Let's just do it backwards for you. Okay, you get the idea. Yes?
Why is it that a nor'easter is such a bad storm?
That's a good question. I don't really know the answer to that. Something weird happens with the nor'easter. Yeah, I don't know. I just know that, yeah, I mean, you know when 2 feet of snow dumps on your driveway, then it's a nor'easter. But I don't know the exact physics of what a nor'easter is, unfortunately. Okay, so there's these global wind patterns, which are basically weather. And what happens is basically about a mile above the surface of the Earth and higher, the wind blows constantly. And it really doesn't depend on what's below it. So trees and whether there's a house there or whatever, it's kind of irrelevant. The wind's just whipping around a mile above us. And that's due to this solar heating. So it's due to the sun hitting the Earth and also the rotation from the Coriolis effect. So this is a map of global wind resource. The darker colors, this is a terrible map, I need to get rid of this. So here's a lesson what not to do with making a map. White is both really high and really low on this, which is this. So see, like over the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, how it's white, that means the wind's really high, whereas over the middle of South America, it's white, the wind's really low there. I don't know who did this. If you're ever making maps, if you're a cartographer one day, don't do this. Anyway, the winds tend to be highest over the ocean because there's nothing to slow it down, right? The wind just blows across the entire Atlantic Ocean, it whips up really high winds over mountains as well sometimes. Yes?
Is it at all possible to put wind turbines in the middle of the ocean where the wind's really high?
What do you think would prevent you from doing that?
Getting the power?
Yes. Transmission would be one of the issues. Also, if it broke, it'd be a real pain to get to, right? But transmission would be a real nightmare. What's that?
How would you stabilize the giant?
They'd have to float, right?
Yeah.
So there are floating wind turbines. We're going to talk about floating wind turbines, actually. So I'll get to floating wind turbines, but that's actually what I work on, is floating turbines. Yeah, the wind's stronger as you go offshore, but
Yeah, no, it didn't seem to make sense. I was just wondering if
Yep.
if anyone tackled with
People we're moving offshore with wind, farther and farther offshore, partially because the wind is stronger, partially just honestly because to get away from where people can see it. But you can't go too far, at least not yet. Okay, so let's do a brief history of wind power. The first use of wind power was sailing. I think this is a Phoenician boat, although I don't really know for sure, but I think the Phoenicians were like the first sailors, and then the Greeks and whatever. But people have been harnessing the wind for sailing for a long time. And then this is a grinding mill from Persia in around 900 AD. And basically there's the wall on one side, but it's open on the other, so the wind flows through, and it causes this thing to spin around, and it basically grinds two rocks together, and you put grain in there, and it grinds it. So that's probably the earliest windmill. The Europeans started to use wind power pretty avidly, starting in around the Middle Ages for sawing, pumping, grinding. This is like a classic Dutch style windmill. I lived in Holland for about a year and a half, and there actually are windmills around. If you've ever been there, they're pretty cool. And so they you know, actually Holland's pretty interesting. About half the country used to be underwater, and what they did was they built a windmill, and then they built a little wall next to it, like a maybe 3-5 foot high wall, and they just pump the water and throw it over the wall, and they'd have new land, and then they'd build a wall a little farther out, pump the water and throw it over the wall, and they reclaimed like an area like the size of probably Rhode Island or Connecticut just by doing that. So a lot of Holland is actually underwater, and there's all these systems of canals and locks and dikes all throughout the country to prevent it from flooding if there are floods. So anyway, so the Dutch were doing this, and then this is kind of the Old West style windmill, which became very popular in the western U.S. in the 1800s. What's nice about these is they can pump water from really deep underground, like 100, 200, 300 feet underground, because most of the Southwest obviously is really dry, but there is water way down below. And so this allowed a lot of uninhabitable land in the West to be opened up to development, agriculture, things like that. They're incredibly reliable. I mean, you'll see these operating on people's farms still. They're pretty impressive. Let's see, so people started to think about using wind to generate electricity in the early 20th century. This was the Smith-Putnam machine, which was built in Vermont in 1930 as a 1.25 megawatt, which means those blades are probably 75 feet long. It was way ahead of its time. It was really pretty incredible that people did this. Which sort of brings us to modern times. Wind energy is really, it's something we can talk about in the last 30 years, more or less. So this is showing the cumulative installed amount of wind in the US in blue, the Europe in purplish, and the rest of the world in the off-white. And if you look at this now, you would say, well, Europe's ahead of us, right? And we're kind of catching up. But if we zoom in on kind of the early 80s up until 1990 period, there we go. It's a different picture. So actually, wind really started in the U.S. In really California in the early 80s, and actually it's kind of cool. Is a bunch of UMass grads who were kind of at the forefront of this, who started some of the first wind companies. Yep, exactly. Long and illustrious wind program at UMass. And so Europe was way behind. And then take a guess what happened in 1985? Why all of a sudden the U.S. kind of stagnated and Europe took off?
Oil.
Reagan. Good answer. More specifically.
End of the Cold War?
No, that was until '89.
Is the oil embargo related to this?
No, that was early mid-'70s. It was so this early period might be called the period of irrational exuberance, where have you ever driven through like Ultimate Pass, California? There's thousands of these tiny little windmills, and they're kind of ugly, and they kill eagles, which is a real bummer. Yeah, it's not good. They've stopped making them like this. But at first, no one really realized any of this. Just building wind, they thought it was great. And so all these companies, actually from Europe, came to the U.S. to learn how to make wind turbines. Vestas, you might have still heard of. It's the biggest wind company in the world right now. A bunch of these others sort of merged with other companies. A bunch of U.S. companies were here as well. You've probably heard of none of these. U.S. Wind Power, which became Kinetic, eventually became Enron Wind. Enron went bankrupt, and GE bought them for like pennies on the dollar. And now GE has a big wind program. But that goes all the way back to that company. What happened was actually the U.S. Reagan was the right answer, sort of. No, it was the right answer, but more specifically, the U.S. discontinued renewable energy incentives for production. Europe implemented them, and their industry kept going, and the U.S. industry basically died for a 15-year period. So incentives matter. I mean, I'm not going to argue politics, but if you want an industry to grow, sometimes you need to incentivize it, and I think the U.S. pulled the plug too quickly. One, I think, difference between back then and now is small versus large, and answer to the question of why wind turbines have gotten so big. This is a nice visual representation of it. So this is Tehachapi in California in 1985. This is one Vestas V90 turbine, which is a 3 megawatt turbine, and all of those turbines together put out the same amount of power as that one turbine. Yeah. So, I mean, if you lived somewhere and someone was going to put in wind, what would you want? Probably the big one, I think, rather than that, right? So the reason those killed eagles was the eagles would perch on the lattice, and then like rodents would live underneath, and then the eagles would leap out to go like catch a mouse or something, and they would get chopped up into blades. It's really sad. So they've shut most of these down because no one wants. If it was pigeons, no one would care, but. You can't kill eagles. So anyway, so I think most people would answer large here is probably better. What does a wind turbine look like? It tends to look like this. It's 3 blades, upwind, meaning the blades pass in front of the tower, not behind the tower. Horizontal axis, meaning the shaft that spins around is pointed horizontally. The Persian windmill I showed, that's a vertical axis turbine, right? It's spinning like this. On land, they tend to be around 2 megawatts now in size. Offshore, they're growing. They're now up to 5 megawatts, and prototypes on the size of 7 or more. Yes?
Is that per year?
No, a megawatt is a unit of power. So it's when it's fully rated, it produces 5 megawatts of power. An average house in the U.S. probably uses a couple kilowatts. So.
And then UMass uses about 17, as you were saying.
17 megawatt hours?
I think per year.
Okay, megawatt hours per year. That could be true.
Kilowatts, maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know what the number is. So it's put in units of households. A 1 megawatt turbine would probably power on the order of 500 to 1,000 houses. So a single turbine on a couple thousand houses, let's say. So a lot, right, for one turbine. It's pretty good. Hub heights tend to be about 90 meters high, so a little less than 300 feet. And so a 5 megawatt turbine, here we go. So actually, why do you think turbines have gotten bigger? Yes? Or you can ask your question, and then I'll answer.
How much does one of those cost?
Good question. About $1 million a megawatt on land. So a 2 megawatt on land costs about $2 million. Offshore, it's probably double that, if not a little higher. It's hard to say. We've never built one offshore in the U.S. because of a variety of reasons. Is anyone from the Cape?
I was just down there.
Yeah. So anyway, the Cape. People from the Cape have very strong opinions about offshore wind. We can talk about that later. So anyway, yeah, it's the Cape Wind project, for instance, is going to be about a 400 megawatt project. Will probably cost about $1 billion or so. It's expensive, pretty slow on power, but they're not cheap. So why have turbines gotten bigger? Yes.
Because the taller they are, the more like wind there is up there.
So that's definitely true. Wind increases with height above the ground. What about why have the blades gotten bigger?
Wind?
Yeah, capture more wind. That's right. That's exactly right. So basically, the power that you can capture is proportional to the area. So you double the area, you double the amount of power. And so you can look here at the progression of the size of wind turbines. A 5 megawatt turbine right now has 126 meter diameter, which means it has 63 meter long blades, which are basically 200 feet long. So, or let's say another way, about 70 yards long. So almost a whole football field is one blade. But you could easily walk down a good chunk of it until it sort of you had to crawl. But they're massive, absolutely gigantic. 10 megawatts probably have 160 meter diameter, so 80 meter blades. So 90-yard blades. Yeah, it's a big blade. Yes.
What exactly is the maintenance on this? Like, what if the blade breaks or something?
It's a good question. It happens. If a blade breaks, you bring a crane, you take it off, and you put a new blade on. I might have a picture of blade maintenance. So blades are made of fiberglass, like what a boat hull is made out of. They're relatively light and they're hollow, given how gigantic they are, but they're still big, and it takes a big crane to raise them. This is actually that's a great question about maintenance. So these turbines are maintained by guys on helicopters showing up and maintaining it. So that's not like an illustration. That's a picture of a guy in a helicopter dropping down to maintain a turbine. And the nacelle where all that stuff is like the size of your house, give or take. It's huge. Well, it depends how big your house is, but like it's bigger than my apartment. So yes, please.
Are those floating or are they secure?
Those are not floating. They're offshore. They're called monopiles, which are basically it's a big steel tube, and you jam it into the ground. And there's a pile driver, which is just a giant hammer, and it just hits the thing into the ground. It is really noisy, you can imagine. And then the top's all mangled, so they have to like cut off the top, and they put a transition piece on, and then a boat comes along, and it picks up the wind turbine tower and puts it on, and then it raises that nacelle up on a giant crane with 2 of the blades on, and then it raises a 3rd blade up and installs it. It's incredible.
Doesn't that kill the marine life that used to be there?
Um,
You just jam the steel rod.
so, jam the who?
A steel rod into the ground.
Oh, well, so that's a good question. It's not trivial. Once the turbines are in, they're actually have been shown to enhance marine life. So they form like sort of artificial reefs, kind of. And so like algae will grow on the bottom, and then little fish will come around, and bigger fish will come along. And so there's a really good fishing in a wind farm. When you're putting the pole in, I'm sure there's little critters on the ground who don't get out of the way. I know. It's not like a cute seal or something. They'll swim away. Whales get out of the way. Apparently, someone told me this guy I know was involved in a wind farm being installed, and when they're hammering in the piles, a bunch of the fish floated to the top because they had been stunned by the noise. But then, like 10 minutes later, they sort of they woke up with a smile. So yeah, they got kind of stunned. It's noisy. I think this raises an interesting issue, though, which is a lot of times people evaluate offshore wind in the vacuum of does it cause any environmental problems? And the answer is sure. A bird will get killed once in a while because it'll fly into a blade. No, it's true. The biggest killer. It's not that funny. It's sort of funny, with dark sense of humor. But the biggest killer of birds in the world by far is office buildings, glass and office buildings. And the second biggest is cats. Wind turbines kill about a bird a year. I'll get to you in just a second. I want to finish this point up. I think the important point is that you have to measure things relatively. So what's the damage done by burning coal? It produces mercury, which causes birth defects, among other things. It produces carbon, which leads to climate change. Have you ever seen a mountain be strip mined for coal? They literally cut the top off a mountain, and it's just gone. And it's just a mess of just sludge. So there are environmental consequences of producing wind, but the relative consequences are substantially less than things like oil and coal and natural gas. So that's, I guess, how I argue. You were next, and then I'll get to you.
So how does it actually take the wind and make it energy?
I will do that on the next slide.
So I would like to ask where the picture is from, like where in the world?
Where in the world is that? That's somewhere, I think, off the north coast of Germany, although not positive. So it's a Riva turbine, which is, I think, a French company, but I think that's a German wind farm. And I'll show in a couple slides where offshore wind has actually been installed around the world. Yes.
How fast can
How fast they spin. So that one will rotate about every 5 seconds. which seems kind of slow except the blades are so long that the tip is actually traveling 180 miles an hour or something. So the tips are going fast. So you look at it, it's kind of mesmerizing. It's doing this big long thing. And I just stood under a turbine a couple weeks ago, and it looks so slow and majestic. And then you stand underneath, and this thing just comes whipping by over your head at like 100, 120 miles an hour. It's pretty cool. Okay, so they're getting bigger. I promised I would tell you how we convert power to energy, and I will do that in a slide or two. The installed capacity of wind has increased a ton over the past 15 years. It's grown around 30% a year, give or take. Next year, it might not grow so much in the U.S. because, once again, the incentives, the financial incentives are possibly being discontinued next year by Congress. So we'll see. But it's growing a lot, right? It's a really nice, big growth trend. On the other hand, I'll get to that. Okay, so who produces wind? Mostly the U.S., Germany, or Europe and China. China, like a lot of these plots, was like almost zero and then shot basically straight upwards over the last 10 years. The U.S. was the largest producer of wind for a few years. We passed Germany, and then China caught us like 2 years later. So we had our window and we blew it. By percentage, Denmark is the largest. They get about 20% of, actually it's about 25% of their electricity from wind now, which is a lot. And so these different plots just show where wind comes from by country and region and things like that. If we look at the U.S., it is the largest renewable source of energy besides hydropower. Hydro is interesting. We don't build new hydro anymore because we've kind of tapped out the number of amazing dams that you can build. They got built, and there's no new hydro, more or less. So if we exclude hydro, wind is the biggest. It's about 1.5% of our electricity production now. It's not nothing. Certainly could be a lot bigger. The national goal is 20% by 2030, which requires a lot of growth. We'll see if we get there. I would argue we could go even higher to like 50% if we wanted to. By state, Texas is the biggest. I think Iowa is second biggest, and then California. It's mostly the Midwestern states. The upper Midwest has a lot of great wind. The Dakotas, Nebraska, Minnesota, Iowa have a lot of wind. Problem is that they don't have a lot of people. There's a little bit of a mismatch where a lot of onshore wind is with where people live. Let me just, you know what? I don't have a slide showing how wind is converted to electricity, so why don't I just tell you? Basically, so the wind causes the blades to spin, right? It's sort of like how an airplane flies. There's aerodynamic forces from the wind flowing over the blades, which causes, instead of the plane to go up, causes the blades to turn in a circle. The blades spin, which turns what's called a low-speed shaft, which is spinning, rotating every 5 seconds. That goes into a gearbox. Think of your bike chain, sort of. Take something going slower and you make it spin faster. So what comes out of the gearbox is a high-speed shaft, which then goes into a generator. The generator is not that much different than what's in a natural gas or a coal plant, where basically they're using internal combustion to cause something to spin, which then turns a generator. So generators are basically just, they're a bunch of copper and magnets, and if you have a shaft inside and you force it to spin, electricity will come out the other side. It's a quasi-simplified version, but that's more or less what happens. And then there's a lot of clever stuff to make it interconnect with the grid and things like that. Okay, so, the one thing I didn't ask before, why don't onshore turbines get bigger than about 2 megawatts? Does anyone have an idea? Yes?
They'd be huge.
Yes. So what specifically do you think would be the issue?
Well, they probably make noise too.
There's some noise, but that's not the biggest limiting factor with size. Yes?
Could they interfere with air traffic?
Good question. They do, but they don't. They tend to keep them away from airports no matter what, even if they're a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller. But yeah, that is actually a really important issue, and especially because of radar, because they interfere with radar. So the FAA and the military have a lot of say in where wind turbines go so that they don't cause issues with that. But yes.
Is it because the wind doesn't flow as fast over the land as it does over.
That
Or
is-
that not?
That is also true. That is definitely true. Actually, it's a much more mundane reason, which is,
Does the turbine hit the ground?
you can just build a tall tower.
Like the diameter of falling, safety and housing.
You keep them far enough from houses that wouldn't be an issue no matter what.
Is it NIMBY?
It is not NIMBY. Well, it's sort of NIMBY, but not. It's even more mundane than that.
Aesthetics.
It's sort of aesthetics are part of it. If you build them even bigger, you'll probably have more people having issues with them. But it's actually they're too big to put on a truck and drive down the street. So the blades, like I said, a blade's 70 yards long if it's offshore, right? You can't throw that on a truck. It won't get through any tunnels. You can't take it around a corner. You can't stay in one lane of traffic. Even now, like when they do a 2.5 megawatt machine, they plot these incredibly detailed routes that avoid all major tunnels and sharp corners to get them from the manufacturing plant to the wind farm. To the point where they've talked about just building manufacturing plants where the wind farm is going to go and then just disassembling it and building it somewhere else. Because transporting the blades is so hard. So offshore, right, you just build them in a port, you throw them on a barge, and they can go anywhere. Yes. She was first, then you.
Can you transport them by air? Like, can't a certain amount of helicopters or a jet thingy?
Wow. Probably, but I think it would be so expensive.
I mean, it's all pretty boring.
So some of these blades are manufactured 1,000 miles away, right? So they put them on trucks and they drive them across the country. So I think that would be logistically very challenging. Yeah. You had a question?
Why don't they just make the blades into like multiple pieces and then like near the area they put them together?
That's a good question. Basically, composites like fiberglass are kind of hard to glue and drill. Like steel's nice, right? You can just drill a hole and put a bolt through it. Fiberglass isn't quite as easy to work with in that sense. And you can't weld fiberglass and things like that. There is a company in Germany that makes a segmented blade with 2 pieces and they bolt it together. So it adds extra weight. It's a little more complex. It's much easier to transport, but it's just kind of a trade-off in simplicity versus transportation issues. But yeah, if you wanted to go much bigger on land, you'd almost have to do that. I don't think you'd have a choice. Yes?
How many production factories are there located in the U.S.?
I have no idea. I would say, God, I shouldn't even guess. I'll think back. Tens to hundreds-ish. I don't know. I don't know. There's a lot of. I mean, we have 30 gigawatts of wind on 30 gigawatts of wind on land in the U.S. now. Each made up of 1 megawatt turbines. So there's 30,000 turbines operating in the U.S. give or take. So probably hundreds of facilities to make all those, I would guess. But they're made from all different facilities, right? There's a place that makes the generators and a place that makes the gearboxes and a place that makes the blades, and then they're kind of pieced together somewhere and then they're installed. So it's a tough question to answer. Okay, I'm gonna keep moving. We've been there, we've been here. Okay, offshore wind. So why offshore wind? Or I guess first, what does offshore wind look like? So offshore wind turbines tend to be organized into wind farms, meaning multiple wind turbines, not a single offshore wind turbine. And that's basically because it's a pain to put things offshore. You have to install these cables, you have to get a ship. If you're gonna do it, you might as well put a few out there. Putting one, the cost would sort of overwhelm the benefit. So at least tens, if not hundreds of turbines. The one on the bottom is pretty cool. I think it's very pretty. It's in the Copenhagen harbor, so Copenhagen, the capital of Denmark, and it's about a mile offshore. So I mean, you fly into Copenhagen, and it's just sitting right there, and it's in this kind of seashell arc. So they try to make it. It's not the most efficient way to put the turbines, but it's aesthetically more pleasing, or I find them pleasing in general. Okay, offshore installation, access, maintenance is difficult, right? You have to get on a boat. In the winter, the seas are stormy and rough, and people sometimes can't safely actually access turbines for sometimes months out of the year. So if you have a turbine break in October, you might have to wait till April to get a vessel out there that can actually service and fix it. The turbines are larger, They're interrelated because of their wakes. So this top picture is kind of cool. This guy was flying by in a helicopter and took this picture, and it happened to be that day that there's enough humidity in the air and the temperature and the pressure was right that the humidity in the wakes condensed into clouds. So that's not man-made. Those are just cloud formations, sort of like the contrails of an airplane a little bit, but like in wind turbines. So it's a neat thing. So you can see the wakes, right? Which means basically the flow behind upstream turbines impacts downstream turbines. So they're interconnected. The largest wind farm right now is about 200 megawatts, made up of 80 turbines. The British are proposing gigawatt level wind farms off in the North Sea, and just really immense wind farms being proposed. It's more complex offshore. There's waves, there's ice, there's current, and it's corrosive. Salt water is rough on things. It causes rust and corrosion. Yes?
If like they don't, if like cities don't want wind turbines, you know, within their vicinity, because they think they're ugly or something, but like the company or whatever still wants to make them, couldn't you just find like an offshore area that no one goes to? Like, I'm sure like
You'd be amazed.
or something.
Yeah, so there's a couple ways to respond to that. One is the closer you can put the source of electricity to where it's being used, the cheaper it'll be. So it would be nice to put turbines in Boston Harbor. But there's issues, right? That's Logan, among other things, and people can see it. Also, you'd be amazed how much we use the ocean, if not for, like if you overlay all the different uses of the ocean on a map, the places you can actually put wind near shore are few and far between beaches, protected environmental areas, fishing hatcheries, where whales go to give birth, and all sorts of things like that. It's not quite as easy to find great spots near shore as you might think. Farther offshore, if you want to go 25 miles offshore, there's lots of places where you could conceivably put wind. The problem is it's farther from shore, it's more expensive, the water's deeper, it's harder to get out and maintain them. So there's this huge trade-off of near shore versus far offshore wind in terms of convenience and cost versus basically getting them out of people's views and other things. Yeah. Yes?
So, do you know how, like, there are, like, companies that are, like, putting these wind turbines out in the ocean? So, is there, like, a map of the ocean that there's spaces that are taken up by people? Like, kind of like, you own a piece of the ocean to put turbines on?
So you don't own the ocean. You can lease the ocean for various purposes from various state and federal bodies. And it's an outrageously elaborate and complex and bureaucratic, shockingly, system. So Cape Wind, I think, they had to go through probably 25 or 30 different federal and state agencies to get permits and approval. So the FAA, the EPA, probably Defense Department, God knows what else, the state equivalents. But you can apply, so basically sometimes the Interior Department or the federal government will designate certain areas as being able to be used for commercial use. Just like onshore, say they won't let you mine in the middle of the Grand Canyon, but maybe 50 miles away they'll say, yes, one could mine there, and then they'll sell the leasing rights to some company to do it if it's federal land. But no one can actually own any land offshore, so the government has to sort of allow you to do it.
So even, like, if I have, like, a turbine farm, a wind farm, okay, I don't own that ocean
No.
space?
Nope. No, the government owns the ocean. Yes?
This might be just specific to that picture over there, but is there a reason why it's shaped in a half circle?
Just to look nice.
So there's no physics behind it?
Nope. It's actually, there's the opposite of physics behind it. Or said another way, it's not how you would do it if you wanted to maximize your energy production. Because you can imagine when the wind's blowing sort of this way, each turbine's sitting in the wake of every other one in front of it, and so the ones in the back just don't produce anything. If the wind was always blowing sort of perpendicular to it, that would be nice. They would all be in undisturbed flow. But the wind never blows only from one direction. So No, this was an aesthetic choice. I mean, I'm sure it does fine, but they, the Danes are really proud of their offshore wind and their use of wind, and it's sort of a point of national pride, actually, not contention like it is here. Okay, so this is a wind resource map of the entire U.S. You can see there's a lot of wind in the Dakotas and Montana and all through the central Midwest, but there's not a lot of people. So each black dot here represents 7,500 people. And so you can see the major metropolitan areas in the U.S. tend to be on the coast. People like to live near water. There's 55 million people in the Northeast on the coast. So 18% of the U.S. population is basically between Boston and D.C., give or take. And we also have the highest electricity costs. And we have this incredible wind resource right offshore. So the nice thing about offshore wind is the resource and the population are right next to each other. So if you wanted to produce gigawatts of offshore wind in North Dakota, you would have to transport it 1,000 miles to get it to Chicago or Denver. And if you think building wind turbines is hard, building transmission lines is even harder, actually, on land. It's almost impossible. Yes?
Would you need a smart grid for that, or is that?
Yeah, so the problem is that for that amount of power, you need to put in high voltage, what are called high voltage long distance transmission lines, and you'd have to build them over these huge distances, and it's just never going to happen. Yeah, the smart grid means a lot of different things, most of which I probably don't really understand. But it's not just, smart grid is more than just long distance transmission, although that's part of it to make us more interconnected, but it's also in how you regulate power and how you use power and things like that. A lot of it's on the home side, not on the generation side. Okay, if we look at the offshore wind resource by depth, there's a huge resource in deeper water. So this shows the amount of gigawatts of offshore wind by depth. So in 0 to 30 meters, there's about a gigawatt. In 30 to 60, there's about 630 megawatts. And then in 60 meters or more, there's around 2,500 gigawatts. And so the U.S. averages maybe 500 gigawatts of use. So the wind offshore could easily power the whole U.S. a couple times over. But one thing that's interesting is you can see we're actually lucky in the Northeast. We have this continental shelf and the water's pretty shallow. The West Coast, it just drops like a cliff. It gets deep really quickly. The Great Lakes are wicked deep. Maine's actually really deep as well. The continental shelf stops sort of at the Cape, or northern Mass. But there's nice shallow water all in the Northeast. So this is the U.S. Department of Energy's goal. They want 20% of the wind, or 20% of electricity coming from wind by 2030, with about 54 gigawatts coming from offshore and the remaining 246 from onshore. I think that's not ambitious enough, and you could get a lot more from offshore, but who knows? These right now are the proposed projects in the U.S. There's the Cape Wind one. There's Block Island, which is done by Deepwater Wind, which is in Rhode Island. There's a few off the coast of Jersey and Delaware. Some are in federal waters, some are in state waters, some are bigger than others. None have been built or started construction. There's a chance that Block Island and Cape Wind start construction in 2013, but no one knows for sure. Yes?
You know how the wind turbines are vertical when they spin, kind of like they go like this?
Mm-hmm.
If you made a turbine that went like a helicopter instead, would that produce like a good amount of energy?
No, because the problem with that is if you're looking at it from the side and it's spinning like a helicopter, right? The available area for the wind to pass through is just that little disc, right? Which is much smaller than if you rotate that and then you get this massive circle, right? So at the end of the day, all the wind turbine is doing is taking a little bit of energy out of the wind that's passing through it. So the amount of energy you can get is directly proportional to the size of the area that the wind's passing through. And so if you had like a disc like that, there's just not a lot of area for wind to go through. Yes? Yeah, you were first.
Okay, does the climate change from the CO2 emissions, is that going to affect the amount of wind in the air?
It might in ways that no one can really predict 50 or 100 years out. But as climate change will certainly impact weather patterns, which will impact wind near the surface. In some areas will probably get windier, in some areas probably less windy, and no one can really predict.
There's no guarantee between.
No, because the same amount of solar energy is still hitting the Earth, and so we're still going to generate those large-scale weather patterns in the same way we are now. It's just a question of what happens near the surface because of other things. Yes?
What is the opposition to Cape Wind? Because I know I was just out there and went out on a fishing boat, and there's like a giant tower they've set up that's monitoring. It's like a experimental tower.
Yeah, it's measuring the wind speed and wind direction. I mean, I could talk about this for hours, but the quick version is the only real opposition, or the only real reason for opposition, is people just don't want to see it. They raise questions about environmental impacts, about birds, about this and that. I think almost all of those are basically distractions from the fact that people just don't want to see it. And you know what, you can't argue taste, right? Like, I say something's pretty, you say it's ugly, like, no one's right. I think, it's beautiful down there. But at the same time, we have to get power from somewhere. So if they don't want it from there, do they want a coal plant? Do they want a natural gas plant? I think the thing is they're going to oppose anything. People don't like energy plants built near them, which is why it tends to get built where poor people live, because they can't afford lawyers to fight. So, I don't know. I have a little bit of sympathy because I love it down there too, but I just think, we need to get energy from somewhere. If they want to keep getting power, everyone needs to bear the brunt of the consequences of our energy usage. So, I don't know. I've gotten in long arguments with friends' parents about K-POS, so it's not been pretty. Yes?
So what are the main disadvantages to wind power besides the look?
Besides the taste and aesthetics issue, onshore wind can be done economically and it's cost competitive with other sources of power. So people are making money by building onshore wind farms or wind turbines and selling that power. It's a good business if you put it in the right place. Offshore wind right now is more expensive than it needs to be competitive. So it needs subsidies. I think you could argue any new industry often needs some subsidies at first to make it competitive. Oil and gas also gets significant subsidies, which are not always factored into the discussion. So there's a cost issue. If we want to get all of our power from wind right now, right away, our electricity bills would go up a little bit. It wouldn't double or triple, but they go up. Otherwise, I think the noise issue is mostly moot. I think people are making that up more or less as a way to be opposed to it. I think the bird and fish and bat issue is mostly not a real issue anymore. I think, again, the relative impacts and downsides of wind compared to solar, or excuse me, compared to coal, it's just, it's apples and oranges.
Well, they're like really high up in the air, so can you still use the land?
Oh, yeah. So the blades, the lowest the blades will pass might be 100 feet in the air.
So you can still use the land for like farming or something?
Oh, yeah. So people in the Midwest love them, actually. So in the Midwest, if you own a farm, you'll lease your land to a developer to put wind turbines down there. And so they still just grow crops around it, and they get paid about $5,000 a year per turbine, which is much more valuable than the corn that gets displaced by. So they love it. So in Indiana and Iowa and whatever, it's big business, and we're kind of finicky in New England. I think well, we don't have a lot of space, and so we guard like the nice parts, I think, really vehemently. But yeah. Yes, Dave.
Could you maybe give us some perspective on how much the cost of renewing the wind energy subsidies would be in relation to how much of our tax cut dollars currently goes to
Oh
oil and
God,
gas?
help me. It would be so small. I wonder the so it's called the production tax credit. You basically, if you produce wind energy, you get your tax bill gets decreased a little bit. by however much you produce. How much does PTC cost?